Top 8 most notorious criminals in the U.S. Since 2000, have you ever looked at a quiet neighbor, a friendly old man, or a man in uniform and wondered if they could be a serial killer? From killers who left no trace, to kidnappings that shock the nation, to criminal masterminds whose minds rival Hollywood villains. These fiction individuals didn't just terrify America, they changed the way the FBI investigates crime. Who are they? And why do their stories haunt us to this day? 1. Joseph James D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer. Date of birth, November 8, 1945. Location, Auburn and Sacramento, California, USA. Arrested April 24th, 20. Charges, murder, rape, burglary, stalking, psychological terror, total victims, at least 13 murdered, over 50 rapes, and more than 100 burglaries. Joseph James D'Angelo, once a police officer, was in fact the man behind one of the most terrifying crime sprees in California's history, from the mid-1970s to the early 1980s. For over a decade, he broke into homes at night, masked and armed, targeting couples. He would rape, torture, and sometimes kill them, all in complete calculated silence. What made him especially dangerous was his chilling intelligence and methodical approach. D'Angelo stalked his victims for days, cut phone lines, mapped out escape routes, and often used household items, like cords or shoelaces, to commit his crimes, leaving minimal evidence. In many cases, he tied up the husband and raped the wife right in front of him. The terror of the Golden State Killer haunted California for years. Despite collecting DNA samples, authorities couldn't identify the perpetrator. After 1986, the attack stopped and the investigation went cold. It wasn't until 2018 that a breakthrough came. Through genetic genealogy, investigators used DNA databases like GED Match to trace a distant relative of the suspect. From there, they narrowed down the list and began covertly collecting D'Angelo's data from a car door handle and discarded trash. On April 24, 2000, D'Angelo was arrested at his home in Sacramento. By then, he was a 72-year-old man living an ordinary life with his family. His neighbors never suspected a thing. In June 2020, he pled guilty to 13 counts of murder and 13 counts of kidnapping to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and is now serving his sentence in a California state prison. 2. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. Date of birth, March 9, 1945. Location, Wichita, Kansas, USA. Arrested February 25, 2005. Charges, first-degree murder. 10 victims. Nickname, BTK, short for bind, torture, kill. Dennis Lynn. Rader is one of the most chilling serial killers in American history. Between 1904 and 1991, he murdered at least 10 people in Wichita, Kansas. What made his crimes especially terrifying was how he relished every step of the process, carefully planning, stalking his victims for weeks, and leaving his infamous signature, BT. Rader wasn't an outcast or drifter. He was a seemingly model citizen, a devoted father, a good husband, the president of his local church congregation, and an employee in animal control. This double life allowed him to evade suspicion for decades. His victims ranged from women and children to entire families. He would often bind them, psychologically and physically torture them, and then kill using his hands, ropes, or even plastic bags. He photographed his crime scenes and kept mementos to remember his acts. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Rader taunted authorities by sending anonymous letters to the press and police, boasting about his murders. Then in 1991, he vanished. Many believed he had died or moved to another state, but in 2004, after a local newspaper ran a piece marking the 30th anniversary of his first killing, BTK resurfaced. Rader sent a series of letters to news outlets and police, signing off once again as BTK. But this time he made a critical mistake. He mailed a floppy disk with metadata that led investigators to a church in Wichita. Secret surveillance and a DNA match from a sample linked Dennis Rader directly to the old crime scenes. On February 25, 2008, he was arrested right outside his home. In court, he coldly described each murder as if he were reading a job report. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole and is currently serving his sentence at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. 3. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. The Grim Sleeper. Date of birth, August 30th, 1952. Location, Los Angeles, California, USA. Arrested July 2010. Charges, serial murder. Nicknamed the Grim Sleeper, referring to his long dormant period between killings. Lonnie David Franklin Jr., infamously known as the Grim Sleeper, terrorized South Los Angeles for nearly 3 decades. His nickname came from what appeared to be a long hibernation period, where he seemingly stopped killing between 1988 and 2002, leading the public and police to believe the murderer had disappeared. A former military serviceman, Franklin later worked as a city sanitation and garage worker. He lived in an ordinary neighborhood, had a wife and children, and blended in well with his community. No one suspected that his garage was hiding a dark trove of disturbing photographs and evidence of his crimes. From 1985 to 2007, Franklin murdered at least 10 women, mostly black, from impoverished neighborhoods, and often involved in drug use or sex work. His victims were typically shot with a small caliber gun, and their bodies dumped in alleys, trash bins, or parks. Franklin was particularly dangerous because he often befriended his victims, lured them to his home, then attacked and killed them, only to return to his normal life as if nothing happened. Franklin eluded justice for so long, largely due to systemic neglect of crimes in poor communities. For years, the murders received little attention. It wasn't until a special task force was formed in the early 2000s that investigators began re-examining the cold cases. DNA from the crime scenes was uploaded into a national database and produced a partial familial match to Franklin's son, who was in custody for an unrelated crime. Undercover officers began to surveil Franklin. A disguised officer posing as a pizza delivery man collected DNA from leftover food Franklin discarded. The results were a perfect match to the DNA found at multiple crime scenes. On July 7, 2010, Franklin was arrested. At his home, police discovered over 1,000 photos of women, many personal belongings believed to be from victims, and clear forensic evidence linking him to multiple murders. In 2016, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was sentenced to death for 10 counts of murder. However, on March 28, 2020, he was found dead in his cell at San Quentin State Prison, California. The cause of death was never publicly disclosed. 4. Samuel Little, America's most prolific serial killer. Date of birth, June 7, 1940. Location, Los Angeles, California, USA. Arrested September 5, 2012. Charges, serial murder, nicknamed the choke and stroke killer. Samuel Little is officially recognized as one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. While only 8 of his murders were confirmed at the time of his arrest, His true body count would eventually stun the nation. Little began his killing spree in the 1970s, moving from state to state, from Florida to California, targeting vulnerable women, often Black, addicted to drugs, or involved in sex work. Because of the victim's marginalized status, law enforcement often overlooked the cases or failed to connect them. Little's killing method was disturbingly simple and chilling. He strangled his victims to death and then dumped their bodies in remote or abandoned areas. He constantly moved, changed his methods, and left few clues. Many of the murders went unsolved for decades, with some cases even classified as overdoses or accidental deaths. Little lured women into his car, took them to isolated spots, and held them without leaving a trace. For nearly 4 decades, he operated under the radar, leaving a trail of bodies and unanswered questions. The lack of evidence, combined with the vulnerability of his victims, allowed him to escape justice again and again. Everything changed in 2012 when Samuel Little was arrested for a violent assault. During the investigation, detectives uncovered connections between him and several cold cases. In interviews with investigators, Little began confessing to a staggering number of murders, offering details only the real killer would know. He even drew portraits of his victims from memory, helping police reopen and connect dozens of unsolved cases. In 2014, he was convicted of 3 murders in Los Angeles and sentenced to life in prison. Over time, he confessed to killing 93 women across the U.S., and though only some of these confessions have been fully verified, the FBI believes most are credible. Experts estimate his actual victim count could exceed 100. Throughout the investigation, Little showed chilling detachment and a strange sense of pride in recounting his crimes. He provided precise information about victims that law enforcement couldn't have obtained otherwise. He was serving a life sentence at the California Medical Facility where he continued to confess to additional murders during interviews with investigators. 5. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Date of birth, February 18th, 1949. Location, Auburn, Washington, USA. Arrested November 30th, 2001. Charges, serial murder, confirmed. Victims at least 49, though Ridgway confessed to over 70. Gary Leon Ridgway, known as the Green River Killer, is one of the most notorious and prolific serial killers in U.S. history. For over 2 decades, Ridgway terrorized the suburbs of Seattle, with the bodies of murdered women frequently discovered near the Green River, in forests, or in remote areas. Ridgway led a seemingly normal life. He worked at a truck painting factory, had multiple marriages, and was active in his church. On the surface, he appeared shy, quiet, and unremarkable. But beneath this ordinary exterior hid a cold-blooded predator who specifically targeted sex workers and runaway teens. His method was disturbingly methodical. Ridgway would pick up victims along the roadside, offer them money for sex, and then drive them to isolated areas. There, he would strangle them to death, rarely using weapons as he didn't want to leave evidence. He often raped their corpses and revisited the dump sites to relive his crimes. By the mid-1980s, police knew they were dealing with a serial killer, but forensic technology at the time wasn't advanced enough to identify him. Ridgway was questioned multiple times over the years, but always slipped through due to a lack of solid evidence. It wasn't until the early 2000s, with the advancement of DNA technology, that investigators made a breakthrough. In 2000, cold case evidence was re-examined using updated DNA testing. Semen samples taken from several victims matched Ridgway's DNA. On November 30th, 2001, Gary Ridgway was arrested at his workplace. To avoid the death penalty, Ridgway agreed to cooperate fully with investigators. He confessed to murdering more than 70 women and led police to several burial sites of still missing victims. In 2003, he was sentenced to 48 consecutive life terms without parole, with an additional life sentence added in 2011. Today, Gary Ridgway is serving his sentence at Walla Walla State Penitentiary in Washington. He remains the most confirmed deadly serial killer in the history of the American justice system. 6. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber, date of birth, July 22nd, 1993, location, Cambridge, Massachusetts, USA. Arrested April 19th, 2010. Charges: terrorism, murder, use of weapons of mass destruction. Casualties: 3 dead, over 260 injured. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, born into a Chechen immigrant family in the UN, was once seen as a bright student, well liked by peers, and seemingly kind and gentle. But behind his youthful face hid extremist beliefs and a deadly plan that would shock the entire nation in April 2013. On April 15, 20, and as tens of thousands gathered near the finish line of the Boston Marathon, a beloved and symbolic American sporting event, 2 pressure cooker bombs filled with nails and ball bearings exploded seconds apart. The blast killed 3 people and injured more than 260 others, many of whom lost limbs in the carnage. The attackers were identified as brothers Tamerlan Tsarnaev and Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, 19. After a 3-day manhunt, the FBI released surveillance photos of the suspects, launching an intense search across Boston. The brothers killed an MIT police officer while attempting to flee, hijacked a car, and headed to the suburb of Watertown. A violent shootout ensued. Tamerlan was wounded and captured, but during the chaos, Dzhokhar ran him over while escaping. He evaded authorities for nearly 24 hours by hiding in a covered boat in a suburban backyard. On April 19, 2013, after the homeowner noticed blood, police surrounded and arrested Dzhokhar. During interrogation, Dzhokhar claimed his older brother was the mastermind. However, he admitted to helping plan the attack, build the bombs, and personally placing one of them in the crowd. The brothers said their motive was to avenge Muslims killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. In 2015, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was sentenced to death after a high-profile and emotionally charged trial. However, in 2020, a federal appeals court overturned the sentence, citing concerns about the fairness of the trial. Then, in 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty. Tsarnaev is currently imprisoned at ADX Florence in Colorado, one of the most secure federal prisons in the world, awaiting execution. 7. James Whitey Bulger, Boston's Dark Overlord. Date of birth, September 3rd, 1929, location, Boston, Massachusetts, USA. Arrested June 22nd, 2011, after 16 years on the run. Charges: murder, drug trafficking, extortion, money laundering, armed robbery, confirmed. Victims linked to at least 19 murders. James Joseph Whitey Bulger wasn't just a crime boss, he became a criminal legend whose life inspired major Hollywood films such as The Departed and Black Mass. Born and raised in South Boston, Bulger entered the world of crime early, with arrests for theft, armed robbery, and street gang involvement. By the 1970s and 1980s, he had climbed to the top of Boston's underworld, leading the feared Winter Hill Gang. The gang was involved in drug trafficking, loan sharking, contract killings, and extortion throughout New England. What made Bulger infamous wasn't just his brutality, it was his covert relationship with the FB. For years, he was protected by FBI agent John Connolly, a childhood acquaintance, in exchange for information about rival gangs. Under this protection, Bulger expanded his empire, eliminating anyone in his way while the authorities turned a blind eye. In 1990, when the FBI finally moved to arrest Bulger on multiple charges, a tip from within the Bureau allowed him to flee. He vanished without a trace. For 16 years, Bulger lived in hiding with his longtime girlfriend, eventually settling in a modest Santa Monica, California apartment, posing as a quiet, elderly couple. After years of failed leads, the FBI shifted its strategy to finding his girlfriend. This led to a breakthrough when a tip came in from someone who had seen them on America's Most Wanted. On June 22nd, 2011, Bulger, then 81 years old, was arrested without resistance. In 2013, Bulger was convicted of 11 murders and numerous other serious charges. He was sentenced to 2 life terms plus 5 years and was incarcerated at several federal prisons. But his story ended violently. Just one day after being transferred to USP Hazleton in West Virginia, in October 28, Bulger was beaten to death by fellow inmates using a padlock stuffed in a sock. Many believe his murder was a long-awaited act of revenge from within the criminal underworld. 8. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the world's most notorious drug lord. Date of birth, April 4th, 1957. Place of birth, La Tuna, Sinaloa, Mexico. Last arrest, January 8th, 2016. Extradited to the U.S., January 19th, 2017. Charges, drug trafficking, money laundering, murder, leading a transnational criminal organization. Nickname El Chapo, meaning shorty, due to his 5'6", 168 height. Joaquin Guzman, famously known as El Chapo, was the founder and supreme leader of the Sinaloa cartel, Mexico's largest and most powerful drug trafficking organization. For nearly 2 decades, he was the top target of the DEA, controlling vast drug routes that moved cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and marijuana from Colombia through Mexico into the United States. Unlike secretive drug lords, El Chapo was the face of ruthless public brutality. Under his command, thousands died in brutal cartel wars, including police officers, journalists, rivals, and innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. What made El Chapo infamous wasn't just his billion-dollar empire. It was his unbelievable talent for escaping prison. In 2001, he escaped from a maximum security prison in Mexico by hiding in a laundry cart. In 2010, after being recaptured and placed in the Altiplano prison, he escaped again, this time through a 1-kilometer tunnel dug beneath his cell, complete with lighting, ventilation, and even a custom-made motorcycle to ride out on rails. That escape shocked the world and humiliated the Mexican government. Under mounting pressure from the U.S. and international authorities, El Chapo was recaptured for the 3rd time on January 8th, 2016, after a gunfight with Mexican Marines in Los Mochis, Sinaloa. To prevent another escape, he was extradited to the United States in early 2017. His highly publicized trial in Brooklyn, New York, lasted 3 months in 2019 and drew global media attention. He was found guilty on 10 federal charges, including running a criminal enterprise, conspiracy to commit murder, and traffic in massive quantities of drugs. In July 2019, Joaquin Guzman was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years, along with an order to forfeit $12.6 billion in assets. He is currently incarcerated at ADX Florence in Colorado, America's most secure prison, often called the Alcatraz of the Rockies.